and welcome to the third part of the video series helping you to prepare for your internal assessment. Now in this video, we're going to look in more detail at the actual internal assessment itself. So hopefully, by the end of this video, you should be able to state how you're assessed in IB chemistry. You should be able to describe the different parts of what I want in your internal assessment report. You should be able to explain how the internal assessment is actually marked. So here are my references. We have the subject guide for chemistry and also a textbook. So let's look at the general assessment for IB chemistry. So for standard level, you have 3 papers and then your internal assessment. It's the same for higher level, but you'll notice that some of the numbers are a bit different. So if we just compare them, you can see that the overall weighting the 3 different exams is different depending on whether you're doing the standard level or the higher level. Now, the style of the exams is the same. Paper 1 is a multiple choice exam looking at all the content, but you'll notice that the time for the exam is different. That's because the high level exam is out of 40, whereas standard level is out of 30. Now within these, there are 15 common questions, which are in both exams, and the rest are individual for either the standard or the higher level exams. Paper 2 is full of shorter response questions about the content, whereas paper 3 is divided into 2 sections. The first part is more data analysis and looking at experimental chemistry. The second part is based on the option you have chosen. Now an important part here regarding this video series is the fact that the internal assessment is worth the same for both standard and higher. You also get the same amount of time. In fact, the whole process is the same. You're expected to complete the same amount of work, you do the assessment in the same way, you get graded in the same way. So unlike the 3 papers, the internal assessment is completely the same for both standard and higher level. So let's just go back to the slide from the first video and remind ourselves of the experimental method. So you start with some sort of theory, idea, you then develop your research question and hypothesis, you design an appropriate experiment and you carry it out. This will give you data, you then need to process this data, analyze it, which should allow you to draw a valid conclusion. So this is the basic experimental process. Now hopefully you'll remember that this can also be looked at as a cycle, because remember, once you have drawn a conclusion, this could potentially feed back into the original theory, or it could help to develop a new theory. So let's look at the internal assessment. Now I'm going to go through a certain template. Now there is no exact template you have to follow. We're going through these different sections in this order is what I would recommend. Now each of the sections I'm about to go through, we will go into in more detail in subsequent videos. So for now I'm just going to go through them quite quickly, just to give you an overview of what I would expect. So you would start with the research question. You then have a section including your background information, your introduction, let's say. From this, you go to your hypothesis. You then state the major variables, the method of your experiment that you've come up with. You have to do a risk assessment. Now, after your experiment, you will have raw data, which should be included. You then need to analyze this data, produce what's called process data, draw the conclusion from your data. You then need to evaluate your experiment. And finally, you'll have your sources that you've used to help you complete this report. Now, if we just compare this to the experimental method, obviously I've gone into a lot more detail with your internal assessment in the different sections required. But if you look at them it follows the same basic process. Now, why is this important? Because you should be completing your report as you go through the process. The actual experimental process that you need to go through and the different parts of your report are very similar, and they are in the same or very similar order. So do not leave the write-up to the end. You should be doing little parts of the write-up as you go along. Lots of people leave it to the end, and this is not good. Firstly, it can lead to increased stress if you're doing the whole report just before your deadline. And also, it's likely that your report won't be as good. As you go through the process, you might, let's say, make little changes to your method. Now, this is the sort of thing which should be included in your report. It shows that you've identified a problem and you've come up with a solution to that problem. This applies to creative and independent thinking, which can get you marks. Now, if you leave it right to the end to write everything up, you might have forgotten this because you will just be using the data you got at the end. So these little details as you go through can be important in helping you to get marks. So not only will it make the whole process less stressful if you write it up as you go along, it's also likely you'll end up with a better report. Write up the different sections as you go along, and then just put it all together and review it at the end, not just write it at the end. Okay, so let's look at how we actually grade internal assessment. So your overall mark comes from 5 different sections. You get 2 marks for personal engagement, 6 for each of exploration, analysis and evaluation, and then 4 for communication. Now this comes to 24 in the end. I don't know who came up with that. It seems a bit of a strange number to me, but that's what it is. So let's look at each of these sections in more detail. Now I've just cut and pasted the grading descriptors for each section. Now you can see here that they are broken into different sections depending on how good the mark is. So for personal engagement, it's only out of 2, so there are 3 sections. 0, 1 and 2. Now I'm really only going to focus on the top mark because that's what you should all be aiming for. So for personal engagement, you need to show clear evidence that you have been engaged with the process. This can include independent thinking, initiative, creativity. Now below the part in bold, there are 2 different descriptors. Now the first one talks about justification for why you've chosen the area you're investigating. You should have some sort of personal interest in that area. Now this is normally put as a section in your introduction. It doesn't have to be, but for this part, you generally introduce it when you are giving the background information. The second part of the descriptor, however, talks about personal input, initiative, and this should be seen throughout your report. If you are coming up with creative solutions to problems, if you are changing things to make them better, this is showing that you are engaged in the process. So if you just leave personal engagement to a few sentences into your introduction, you cannot access the top mark. You're more likely to just get 1 out of 2. The second part is exploration. Now you can see here, this involves having a relevant and fully focused research question, that your background information is relevant and enhances the understanding related to your study. This is also where your method for your experiment is graded. Okay? You need to have developed a method suitable to the investigation that allows you to draw a valid conclusion. And you also need to have included your risk assessment. Now, a couple of slides ago, I went through the different sections I would expect you to include in your report. And I included a section on variables. Now, you don't technically have to identify those variables like I've suggested, but I really think you should, because it helps you think about how to develop your method. You can see here Now you need to have taken into consideration the significant factors that influence the reliability of your results. If you identify, for instance, the variables you need to control beforehand and you write them down, you're more likely to develop a method which addresses those issues. Now next is the analysis section. Now this includes sufficient raw data. Now if you have an experiment that produces lots of raw data, you only have a maximum of 12 pages for your report. All reports should be between, let's say, 6 and 12 pages. It should really be nearer the 12, to be honest, if you want a good mark. But if your experiment produces streams and streams of data, you can't include it all. So what you would do, you would include a sample of what you've taken and include that in your report. And then you would just explain that further data was taken. But it should be fairly clear from how you've analysed it that there is more. Just take a sample and make it clear. Now, your data processing needs to be carried out in a proper and accurate way to enable a conclusion to be drawn. You need to also make sure you've included measurement uncertainties, things like this. Don't worry, we'll be going through how to do that in a subsequent video. And make sure your data is processed correctly so that a valid and detailed conclusion can be deduced. Now, an interesting point here is that you need to process the data to be able to draw a valid conclusion. But if you make a mistake and you don't actually write down the conclusion that the data suggests, you can still access all the marks in the analysis section, as long as you've actually processed the data correctly. However, if you draw the wrong conclusion, this will affect your marks for the evaluation. Here, you need to describe and justify your conclusion. You need to link it to your research question. You potentially have to compare it to the relevant scientific context, perhaps link it back to your background information. You then have to look at the strengths and weaknesses of your investigation. Now, as you're going through the investigation, you should have identified any problems and try to fix them. So by the time you get to this point, there shouldn't be so many major issues. But having some minor weaknesses is actually a good thing because it allows you to talk about them, which can get you marks in the evaluation section. So you should be putting what were the good parts and what were the not so good parts about your particular investigation. You then need to state how you would have improved this investigation if you were doing the whole thing again. And then finally, you need to look at what further research could be done based on your conclusion. Now, these last 2 points are often confused and put into the same kind of bracket, but they're actually different. You need to be able to say how you would have improved your specific investigation, whilst also then talking about further research, different experiments you could do based on your results and your conclusion. So just make sure these last 2 points are put separately because they're graded separately. And last but not least is the communication. So I've put here the full grade descriptors. And you can see here it's broken into different parts, 0, 1 or 2, 3 and 4. So if you're in one part, but you don't have all of the pieces of information, you might drop down to the lower part, for instance, the 1 or the 3. So let's look at the higher marks again. So how you've presented your investigation is very clear. You've put it in a logical manner. So whereas you don't have to stick to the template I suggested, I really think you should. The report needs to be relevant, concise, which means you just include the information which is important. And you need to include specific scientific terminology and conventions. So obviously scientific language is important, but also things such as significant figures would be marked here. You need to make sure you've used appropriate numbers of significant figures. And don't worry, we'll review this again in a later video. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to state how you were assessed in IB Chemistry, the 3 exams and your internal assessment. should be able to describe the different parts of your internal assessment. You don't have to memorize them, but make sure you refer back to this when you're going through the process. Hopefully you should have some understanding of how your internal assessment is actually graded. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.